Assalamu alaikum, dear guests. My name is Mohammad Al-Samak. I'm the president of Muslim Youth in Motion. We're an organization in Vancouver, Canada. We cater to the youth worldwide and service the youth worldwide. I'm joined today by respected Sayyid Haydar Khoie and respected brother Sajad Jiyad. They're very well known for their political expertise, and their extensive bios are available within our conference postings. Just for the sake of time, I'm going to save sharing those bios with you here. Today our discussion is going to be a political discussion, and we are trying to answer the question, and the discussion of our question of discussion here is, can the GCC coexist with Iran and Iraq? Assalamu alaikum, Sayyid Haydar Khoie and brother Sajad Jiyad.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam.
We're so happy for you to join us. Inshallah, we're going to have a interesting and informative discussion here. So I'd like to start off our discussion, and for the I'm sure that there's going to be a little bit of difference of opinions here, but I'm thinking when it comes to discussing relationships with the GCC, why can't we group Iran and Iraq together? I'll give this question to Sayyid Haydar Khoie to start us off, inshallah.
Assalamu alaikum jami'an. It's an honor and a pleasure to be on this opening panel with you all. And of course, thank you to Sayyid JawadQazwini for all his efforts in bringing us together. I think the simple answer to your question is because Iraq and Iran are very different countries with different systems of governance, different people, and different interests. More importantly, when it comes to Iraq, both the Gulf Cooperation Council on one hand and Iran on the other hand compete for influence inside Iraq. And unfortunately, Iraq is one of the many arenas in the Middle East where we see this conflict play out, often at the expense of Iraq itself and its people. And so Iraqis and Iraq is often caught between the regional ambitions of the GCC on one hand and Iran on the other.
Alhamdulillah. So, so I think for the limited time that we have to discuss this, I think we'll mostly be focusing on Iraq in this discussion, if that's okay with the both of you. So when it comes to the GCC, for those that don't know the GCC, I guess, then it's the Gulf Cooperation Council, and it's made up of the 6 countries: Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Oman, and the UAE. So I'll give this question to Brother Sajad. Why was the GCC formed?
So initially, the idea was to have an economic union that allowed these countries to open up their borders for trade, reduce taxes and tariffs, free movement of labor as well. But with time, they attempted to integrate forms of political cooperation and also economic cooperation. But it hasn't been successful various times because the states differ between each other on how to conduct foreign policy, for example, on security involvements outside of the country and outside of the region. And recently we've had, obviously, as everybody is well aware, the spat between, for example, Qatar and Saudi Arabia and the UAE on issues regarding, for example, Syria and Turkey and Iran and Yemen. And so the GCC at the moment is sort of is split in terms of political orientation. but certainly it has a lot of economic power. And with the sort of recent thawing in relations between Saudi and Qatar, the hope is for those countries that the economic imperative, they need to be quite cooperative in a difficult, period of time for the entire world. We have the pandemic, we had the downturn in oil prices, with several security challenges in the region. Will overcome any of the political differences these countries have.
Inshallah. Haydar, my next question is, why did the 6 GCC countries exclude Iraq, and it being the only Arab Gulf country to be excluded?
I think you have to go back to 1981, when the Gulf Cooperation Council was first formed. 1981, of course, was just 2 years after the Islamic Revolution in Iran, and shortly after the start of the Iraq-Iran war. So the GCC formed as a union, although they were very careful not to mention security or military or defense when forming the GCC, but largely it was formed because of the perceived threat from Iran. But when it comes to Iraq, the GCC supported Iraq in the war against Iran. They funded Iraq in the war against Iran, but they didn't really want to be fighting the war themselves, and hence Iraq wasn't included. But for them, it was very important, whilst the war was ongoing between Iraq and Iran, for them to make sure the Persian Gulf and Strait of Hormuz was safe for the exports of oil. And then, of course, this was in the 80s. And in the 90s, Iraq in 1990 invaded Kuwait. So, of course, joining the GCC wasn't an option. And even after 2003, when the political order in Iraq was changed, by and large, the GCC refused to engage with the political system because of Iran's increased influence in Iraq and the heightened threat the GCC felt inside Iraq.
Very well. That's and Brother Sajad, do you have anything to add?
No, I think Sayyid Haydar said it very, very well. Obviously, Iraq's aspirations is to be closely tied to the rest of the Arab world, to the rest of the Gulf region. And so I expect with time that Iraq develops its economic relations with Saudi and the UAE. At the moment, it's on a very positive trajectory for relations with Kuwait. And then, if the GCC is still around in, say, a decade, potentially Iraq could become a member. If it's not, then I think something else will take its place. But certainly Iraq is looking forward and aspiring to be part of sort of the wider Arab countries' economic unions.
So it's interesting that you say that Iraq is interested, and they are obviously always wanting to improve their relations. How have they improved their relations in recent years? We'll give this question start us off with Sajad.
So, I mean, we've had restored diplomatic relations with, for example, Saudi, with Qatar, and several other countries in the rest of the Arab world as well, which were, cut off, some of them for 20 years plus. So that's been positive. Second, you've had sort of more delegations and trade delegations, governmental officials shuttling between the two countries, participating in sort of exhibitions and trade fairs, things like that. We've had also an increase in numbers, for example, of Iraqi pilgrims going to Hajj and Umrah throughout the year, which has helped to sort of increase cooperation between Iraq and Saudi Arabia. We have now the possibility of, for example, countries like Saudi and UAE being more invested in, especially southern Iraq, in the energy sector, potentially in agriculture. We've had the reopening of the Saudi-Iraqi border for commercial traffic. So, these are all kind of small steps, but the fact is, 15 years ago, relations were non-existent or very, very hostile between Iraq and several other countries. But I think the trajectory is very positive going forward.
And Sayyid Haydar?
Yeah, I mean, Sajad was absolutely right in answering the first question, that really there isn't unity within the GCC itself. With the blockade on Qatar, the Saudi-led blockade, you pretty much had Saudi, the UAE and Bahrain on one side, Qatar on the other side, and Kuwait and Oman in the middle trying to restore relations. But despite there not being unity in the broad sense, after 2003, it really was a Saudi decision to not engage with the political process in Iraq, pretty much boycotting Iraq. And in that respect, the rest of the GCC fell in line. Much of the Arab world actually fell in line. Again, because of the fear that Iran would use Iraq as a base to threaten their interests, and also, to be frank, very much for sectarian reasons too. But as Brother Sajad mentioned, in 2015, Saudi Arabia opened its borders. The Ar border crossing, actually just a few months ago, was opened, and that had been closed for over 30 years. So relations have been steadily improving, and actually much more recently, negotiations between the GCC and Iraq to actually connect the electricity grid from Kuwait to Iraq is going to immensely help Iraq with its chronic shortage of electricity. And it's this very much economic support and integration which will be felt in the summer when we reach peak electricity demand. And of course, this also has a political angle, given Iraq imports so much energy from Iran, and Iraq imports so much energy from Iran, and Iraq wanting to balance its relations in the region. So there's a political dimension to this electricity interconnection, but things are moving in a very positive direction, I think.
Right. So it seems like Iraq has made a lot of efforts to strengthen their relationship, obviously. But is it important for the GCC to include Iraq in these discussions? Brother Sajad?
I mean, it's not on the agenda at the moment, and I think it's difficult to argue that Iraq has to be involved in sort of every discussion and every topic of GCC meetings. But I would like to think that number one, the GCC countries are interested in developing ties with Iraq. Number two, they realize the importance of working with Iraq on the economic front. There's a lot of potential in Iraq, and even things like coordinating on energy policy, for example, to influence oil prices is immensely important. Beyond that, obviously, we have the issues of security, the issues of sectarianism that affects the entire Middle East, coordination on Syria policy, and perhaps most importantly is the Iraq's relations with Iran and how useful that can be to de-escalate tensions in the entire region. So I think going forward, sort of the GCC countries would like to make best use of their ties with Iraq, but it's as if it takes a bit of time to make a lot of progress. So you get several small steps of progress, but in terms of sort of a strategic shift, it's taking sort of longer than we would expect or would like. But on the sort of Iraqi side, I think everybody's looking forward to having improved ties with many of the countries in the GCC.
So I'm sure that a lot of people around the world will be wondering, like, okay, why is this important? Why does it matter if the GCC coexists with Iran, Iraq? This is a very small or very zoned in issue to the Middle East. So why is it actually important for the rest of the world that the GCC does coexist and live harmoniously with Iran and Iraq? For Sayyid Haydar.
Yeah, that's a good question. The short answer is because over half the world's proven oil reserves lie in this region. So it may be a small region, but it's of vitally strategic importance to the rest of the world. And not just over half the world's proven oil reserves, but around 20% of the entire global oil supply goes through this very narrow Strait of Hormuz in the Persian Gulf. So geographically, it's one of the most strategically important waterways in the world. But furthermore, the Persian Gulf, this region, literally connects Asia with Europe, and it's a massive trading hub as well. If you take the GCC as a whole, it's the 11th largest economy in the world. I mean, comparable to Canada and to Russia, and it's the 4th largest exporter in the world, after only China, America, and Germany. So again, it's very important for trade, it's very important for stability, it's very important for energy security. And lastly, I would just add, given Iraq shares a border with Turkey, many European states consider Iraq a neighbor to Europe. So of course, any instability in the Persian Gulf, any instability in Iraq is going to have a knock-on effect on Europe. And we saw this most recently with the crisis in Syria and the massive influx of millions of refugees fleeing to Turkey and then from there to Europe. And so yes, it's a very small part of the world, but it's extremely important, and that's why everyone's eyes are on this region.
And because of that influence and that, like you said, it is a small region, but it has a huge influence on the rest of the world. Does that have to do with why the Western powers feel threatened by a complete union in the Middle East? Brother Sajad?
I mean, that may have been true in the past, when, for example, OPEC was formed and led to sort of, oil crisis in the 70s, and there was friction between sort of America and several Middle Eastern countries, in the past decades. But I think that's probably not as important as it was. I mean, so, for example, America is no longer dependent on all imports from the Middle East. I think, Europe is also making progress with renewable energy. And certainly there is less imperative and even less justification in the eyes of citizens. I think because Iraq, for example, or several countries in the East no longer hold the same importance as they did, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, or even 10 years ago. That means that there's going to be less involvement, less attention to the Middle East. And therefore, if some of these countries decide to become part of a union, if they decide to agree on sort of security, I think probably the West is going to pay less and less attention going forward. I'm not saying this is going to happen in a year's time, 2 years, maybe over the next decade and even further ahead. I just think that the Middle East will have to rely on itself more. It will have to look inwards more, be concerned about relationships among each other without a foreign broker like the US, for example. And obviously, the challenge is going to be that a lot of the petrodollar states, in 20 years' time, for example, oil is not going to be as important. The global economy will have moved on, technologies will have moved on. What are these countries going to do? How are they going to keep their economies going? For a country like Iraq, which is 95% dependent on oil sales, what's it going to do if the oil price crashes, or if people just don't buy oil anymore? They don't need it. What are they going to do? These sorts of questions are going to concern and keep people in the Middle East busy, but not worry so many people based in America or Europe or elsewhere, because they will have moved on from the region.
Sayyid Haydar, are you able to elaborate a little bit more on how the Middle East needs to rely on itself?
I think, again, the situation is very different when it comes to Iraq and Iran. So when we talk about a union being a threat for the West, actually the West is actively encouraging Iraq to have stronger ties with the GCC. And of course, Sajad is absolutely right on the importance of oil not being as important now as it was 20, 30 or 40 years ago. But of course, a cynical take on the dynamics in the region is that Iran represents a threat to the GCC, without which it would be very difficult for the Americans to justify the sale of so many advanced weapon systems to its Gulf Arab allies, and the numbers, quite frankly, are staggering. Over the last 10 years, 40% of British arms sales were to Saudi Arabia.
Right.
The Saudis are also the biggest importer of arms from America, and almost over $100 billion worth of arms were sold just last year. So even if you take oil out of the equation, there remain strong political, economic, and trade ties with the GCC, which is seen as one of the strongest allies of the West in the region after Israel, of course.
Thank you, Sayyid Haydar. We are running out of time. I'm going to ask this. I'm going to, I guess, speed up the conversation here. Do you ever see a scenario whereby Iraq becomes part of the GCC? I know, Brother Sajad, you mentioned that it might look something different, but is that a scenario that you see happening?
I mean, there's potential. It could happen. I don't think it's on the cards sort of in the short to medium term. I think longer term, maybe towards the end of this decade, maybe into the next one, there's certainly potential for that. I think even if Iraq does not join the GCC in a formal sense, it still can be a partner with the GCC Union. It could improve its relations, trade more, for example, cooperate more. I don't think it necessarily has to be a part formally of the GCC to cooperate with it.
Sayyid Haydar, can I get your opinion on this?
Yeah, I agree. Very briefly, I think it's likely Iraq will continue to strengthen its ties with the GCC. We'll see probably more economic, political, possibly even security ties going forward. But I don't think Iraq will ever formally become part of the GCC, mainly for political reasons. I mean, the system of governance in Iraq is entirely different to the monarchies of the Arab Gulf. In Iraq, we have a parliamentary democracy with many competing parties and factions. And it's much more difficult to make these strategic long-term decisions, unlike in the States where such decisions rest with just one man. So beyond this area, we've seen talks with, for example, Jordan and Morocco to join the GCC. And of course, both of those are also monarchies. But I don't think we're going to see Iraq anytime soon. And certainly there are no talks about Iraq becoming a part of the GCC.
We can hope all the nations have a cohesion and a coexistence. So I guess I will, for our discussion today, do you believe, Brother Sajad, that the GCC can coexist with Iran?
Well, I mean, it doesn't matter if I believe it can. It has to. They are in the same area. They are neighbors. They cannot avoid each other, and they've managed to survive this far without any sort of wars or anything too dramatic happening. So I think the future holds the potential for more cooperation. Obviously, I think there is a lot of pressure to reach peaceful settlements. The amount of, as Haydar mentioned, the amount of weapons that have poured into the Middle East, the amount of people that benefit from increased tensions between these countries is just horrendous. And I think it makes much more sense for these countries, rather than spending all their money on weapons and increasing hostility amongst each other, to focus on development, to focus on the post-oil future. And so, I think they have to coexist. And at the moment, I think there's more realization that there's a lot of harm being done because of political differences, where actually the differences between peoples in each country are very, very minimal.
Since they have to coexist, I guess I will ask Sayyid Haydar, do you believe that the GCC also has to coexist with Iraq as well?
I think so, yes. And I think we are largely moving in this direction. Of course, with Iran, for the reasons we've already talked about, geography, demographics, politics, it becomes much more difficult. But this current government in Iraq, led by Prime Minister Mustafa Al-Kadhimi, actually laid out very clearly that balance should be a key pillar in Iraq's foreign policy. And much of this work, much of the groundwork for Iraq's improving ties with the GCC was actually laid by former Prime Minister Abadi. So Iraq very much wants to become an anchor in this increasingly chaotic region, not just a battlefield where these regional and international proxy wars are fought. And of course, with Iran, it's not just for the sectarian reasons you often hear in the media and in policy discussions, because one side is Shia, one side is Sunni. Politically on the ground, they are often on opposing sides of conflict, whether it's here in Iraq, whether it's next door in Syria, or whether it's in Yemen. But as Sajad said, this simply isn't sustainable, and everyone is being harmed from this. And there has to be a different future for all our sakes.
Inshallah, we can always hope and pray, inshallah, that is the case. Well, that concludes our discussion for today. Thank you, Sayyid Haydar. Thank you, Brother Sajad. We'll start with Brother Sajad. Do you have anything you'd like to share about your work or what you're up to these days?
Well, I'm based in Baghdad, so I'm very interested in what's happening here on the ground. I do tend to sort of publish a lot of commentary and think pieces on policy towards Iraq. So it could be good for a lot of people who are concerned about what's going on in the Middle East to read up. Not necessarily what I write, but to read up a little bit more, to be more informed of what's going on. And I think once obviously travel is normalized and people can travel again, I think people will be surprised to see that Iraq has a lot of potential, and it's maybe not as bad as what they make out in the press. Inshallah, people come to Ziyara, people come to visit Baghdad and elsewhere in Iraq and see that there's actually a lot of potential here with obviously young people, but as a whole country, I think there is complete confidence that it will recover from the dark days that we've had in the past.
Inshallah. I encourage anyone who's interested in the political discussion to follow Brother Sajad Jiyad on Twitter. He's very active. Sayyid Haydar, is there anything you'd like to share about the work that you're doing currently, or what you're up to these days?
So I'm also based in Baghdad, and I'm actually setting up a think tank called the Middle East Council, which will cover very much the same topics we're talking about today, but not a think tank in the traditional sense of just publishing studies and papers, actually creating a platform and a venue to have track 2 dialogue initiatives where we can bring in neighbors from around Iraq to sit together and to discuss these highly sensitive topics away from the media spotlight.
Inshallah. And Sayyid Haydar is also very active on Twitter. So if you are interested in what they have to share, inshallah, please do follow them. Inshallah, that concludes our discussion. Once again, I'd like to just share that I'm part of an organization called Muslim Youth in Motion. We're trying to get as much traction as we can. And service to youth, we have a lot of great programs. Please look out for us on Instagram. We're always posting, trying to get the next, I'm trying to be involved and help the youth as much as we can worldwide, inshallah. Thank you, everyone. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.